Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J. For those who don't know, the official end of support date for Windows 10 is October 14th, 2025. Unless something changes on Microsoft's side, that means any PC still running Windows 10 beyond that date will not receive security updates if a major vulnerability is discovered, unless you're willing to shell out a bit of extra money or jump through hoops in the short term. And unfortunately, because of the hardware requirements for Windows 11, that will invalidate a substantial amount of hardware unless you're willing to deal with the caveats of ignoring those requirements. Even if you somehow trust Microsoft after they thought constantly taking screenshots of your computer wasn't a major performance or privacy concern that never should have been countenanced, let alone all the efforts to pass QA duties onto their user base and then wondering why people don't like updating their PC, when it could mean games like Assassin's Creed Origins and Path of Exile 2 suddenly start crashing a bunch. Yeah, I think you can tell my bias going into this, can't you? Fortunately for me, even if my computer does meet those requirements, my father is tech savvy enough to where every PC I've owned before now has been a dual boot machine between Windows and Linux, so I was already well acquainted with the alternatives. In fact, one way my father would punish me for acting up was to change my computer's boot behavior to always send me to Ubuntu no matter what I tried, because back in the early 2010s, getting games to work on Linux that didn't already have a native version was the textbook definition of pain. You have no idea the amount of work that it took for me to get League of Legends working in Linux back in the day. And even then, after the match was made, I'd be compelled to restart the game and had a 1 in 2 chance of making it back in before the match hit the 1 minute mark. I was a bit obsessed with the game back then to put up with that kind of nonsense. Even so, those were the days before Proton and the Steam Deck. And at the time, yeah, you needed to put a lot of effort in to get it working, and it usually wasn't a good one-to-one. Now though, there's a lot of chatter about it being just as good due to how much work has gone in to make compatibility layers like Proton work so well. Thus, when my motherboard started showing issues, I upgraded it and my SSD, got a new power supply and case while I was at it, and was determined to see just how much of my game library was actually playable. To find out for sure, I split my SSD in half, dedicating one half to my day-to-day operations, while also setting up another OS with the most normie version of Linux I could think of, the long-term service version of Ubuntu. No frills, no extra software save for what was required to record the games and catalog performance quirks in the moment, with my beautiful 1440p ultra-wide monitor compelled to a standard 1080p display so I could properly show off every time an error arose, without having to look at my second monitor for long periods of time. So, let's see just how well gaming in Linux works on the 100 plus games I tried out. To get us started, we first turn to Steam, since the overwhelming majority of PC game sales go through it, which makes things very easy for us because Valve, having dealt with Microsoft shenanigans before, tasked a small army of programmers to ensure that games will work on the Steam Deck. The main way this is done is through Proton, a compatibility layer which is a combination of 3 things. First, a program called Wine, which is a ubiquitous Windows compatibility layer that's existed since before most of us, myself included, have been alive. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? Second, it includes DXVK, which takes a look at what a game is doing with DirectX, the most common graphics renderer in Windows, and converts it to an open source graphics handler called Vulkan, which can be used in Windows or Linux. Finally, it'll sometimes throw in game-specific patches if either of those don't cut it, which is generally frowned upon for Wine, but if you're a company that really wants to sell your Steam Deck, you'll put in the effort to make sure the popular stuff works on your custom Arch Linux variant. To demonstrate how useful Proton is as a compatibility layer, one need look no further than my most played game on Steam, Torchlight 2. This is a game with a native Linux version, so you'd think that such a thing would be unnecessary, but I wouldn't even need to go and mess with Proton versions or anything of the sort. The thing is though, when I first tried to run this in my main OS to ensure everything was working fine there, it turns out that there was some eccentricity about the launcher it used to where it wouldn't properly load up. I could spend a while fiddling with this and eventually getting it to work, knowing that since its developer closed its doors years ago that I would have to go through this rigmarole again someday. Or I could just compel it to use Proton and have it work perfectly after downloading less than a gigabyte of extra files. When it starts becoming faster for me to set up and run the compatibility layer over the native version, I think your compatibility layer is in good shape. The main curiosities I had were how well the system would perform for both fairly new games and for fairly old games. The former is where any issues with the compatibility layer will be noticeable with a game's performance, and the latter may have all sorts of eccentricities that'll have to be grappled with. On the higher end, it seemed that I would run into consistent issues getting newer games to work. After all, my PC was designed to withstand anything from the 2010s at 1080p 60fps, so when the compatibility layer was needed, both Satisfactory and Baldur's Gate 3 showed some issues whenever it was having to load in a bunch of data. In Satisfactory's case, this happened whenever the save button was hit, including autosave, which sometimes did weird things with physics if I was using the game's jetpack. In Baldur's Gate 3, it primarily affected cutscenes, which was unfortunate, but since the game is largely turn-based, it's manageable, and could likely be avoided by just knocking the graphics settings down. And then I began to wonder if there was some issue with how my main OS was set up, because after finishing Satisfactory and busting Grim Dawn back out, apparently throwing electric caltrops into a large group of enemies was a surefire way to make the game stutter, if not outright freeze the screen for 2 seconds, which in that kind of game could be a death sentence. I was able to muscle through it to an extent, since that wasn't my main damage source, and even took down the base game's final boss in that condition, but that then made me wonder if there was something more serious going on. After all, Grim Dawn originally released in 2016, and my computer had zero trouble with the game in Windows, with the only differences being the motherboard being slightly different and the compatibility layer. Thanks to that, I switched over from my main OS to the test OS to see if I had somehow messed things up while trying to get some other software to work in Wine. And strangely enough, it seemingly worked better there than it did under Windows. Granted, I had sometimes played it while rendering footage, but still, that was confirmation that I had messed something up in my main OS, which then seemingly fixed itself when I tried out both Grim Dawn and Baldur's Gate 3 months later. I ended up swapping out Ubuntu Studio LTS for Kubuntu's latest anyway, as I wanted to go back to the bleeding edge, but that's beside the point. That said, because of how I installed Steam on the test OS, apparently it takes a lot longer on the initial load, and may cause some other problems we'll be discussing later. So the experimentation carried on, and as I continued playing through stuff, I started noticing a weird trend. There was a time period in the mid-2010s where some developers were attempting to support Linux directly, with all sorts of games being given native versions rather than needing a compatibility layer. However, as I was going through a lot of my library, Torchlight 2 was not the exception as far as issues getting native games to work. There are a lot that worked right out the gate, but there are also a lot that weren't so lucky. And what was even stranger is that, in a lot of cases, compiling the game into Proton unironically made it work better. Usually the issue was a matter of just not going to the correct monitor when switching to full screen, and not offering a good option to do so without tampering in the backend. This affected Dungeons of Dreadmore, FTL Faster Than Light, Paranautical Activity, You Must Build a Boat, Desktop Dungeons, and even the 2 Half-Life 1 expansions, namely Blue Shift and Opposing Force. This also included War for the Overworld, though that one didn't start causing problems until after I tried to go from full screen to windowed mode, and only after that did it start going to the wrong monitor. There were also cases where apparently the Windows and Linux versions keep different cloud saves, which meant there was a period of time where I thought I had accidentally overwritten my progress on FTL Faster Than Light, with this also appearing for Space Pirates and Zombies, Pillars of Eternity, Terraria, Psychonauts, and Borderlands 2. And sometimes the games had other issues that plagued them, similarly to the Torchlight 2 example. Gratuitous space battles was a black screen whenever you enter the actual battle component. Space Pirates and Zombies required me to uncheck a box in order to guarantee I'd still have a functioning mouse if I alt-tabbed out of the game and then tabbed back in, a fact that admittedly also applied to the Proton version. Serious Sam 3 had the wrong monitor trouble, but also made it to where half the game wasn't visible. Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor had serious performance issues that I didn't stick around long enough to see the full effects of because holy crap, look at this! Unoptimized for your hardware indeed. Frozen Synapse didn't have working audio. Sanctum 2 would crash every few minutes, rendering it unplayable. Shotgun Farmers worked just fine when playing on my own, but the option to join a lobby is basically non-existent, as the button used to access it is missing, and even a direct friend invite failed to work properly. Medieval 2 Total War had multiple bugs that I encountered on both the base game and expansion campaigns, which ranged from siege equipment not registering hits to desktop crashes, almost all of which affected the combat screen at a frequency that I don't recall encountering from the game back in the day. Shogun 2 Total War threw a seg fault before even opening, which for non-technical people basically means it crashed on startup. The Proton version also had trouble with a really outdated launcher if it's trying to bust out Adobe Flash Player, but it was a minor hiccup before starting the game, and there were no further issues beyond that. The Stanley Parable closed immediately upon hitting the play button, without being courteous enough to give a warning like the prior example. Sega Mega Drive and Genesis Classics didn't allow me to use the simple launcher, and had some hiccups on the main display in the not simple launcher. BioShock Infinite didn't let me move my mouse into the top third of my screen, and attempting to tamper with my OS display settings to fix it caused it to default to the wrong monitor. This was also a case where enabling Proton didn't straight up fix it, as while those were no longer issues, it looked as if there were either graphical issues or missing textures from doing so. Perhaps the most embarrassing out of them all though? Half-Life 2's cutscenes were a black screen. and Half-Life Source literally wouldn't load the main menu. I had to compile both into Proton to get around the issues. An embarrassing oversight if ever there was one, especially given the recent 20th anniversary edition for the former. For every game I didn't explicitly call out as such, the problems vanished when I switched to using Proton. Now, bear in mind that a lot of these were made for early to mid-2010s Linux, which means there'd be a fair number of differences for how the OS works now compared to then. That said, when it starts to take more time to get a PC game to cooperate than it does to set up an emulator, I think we've got a problem on our hands. I'm not even joking either. I was able to get a Citra fork set up and running faster than it would have taken me to fix Torchlight 2's issue, at least without the Proton button. All in all, there was plenty of weirdness from native Linux games, and while we're on the subject of games that had trouble, let's go down the line for games where there were issues which were severe, and didn't necessarily have an easy fix. Repo. Remember how I said that the way I installed Steam may have had unintended consequences for how long it takes a game to load in? Repo presented a different issue for the same reason. For the unfamiliar, the game is similar to Lethal Company, i.e. a co-op horror game. And since it uses your microphone for you to talk to people in your immediate surroundings, getting that to work is kinda important. But because I installed Steam via Snap on the test OS, it didn't find my microphone, and fiddling with the settings to try and wrestle it into submission would just cause the lobby to freeze for 30 seconds to 2 minutes, which it also consistently did every time a lobby began on top of that. And I know this because outside of window resizing being a bit clunky on my main OS, where I did use the direct installer, it functioned perfectly. Well, there's also no ultra-wide support for the times I played it, but hey, early access, right? Short version, if that made no sense to you, download installer from Steam's website, don't use Ubuntu Software Center, or whatever they're calling it now. Yes, I am talking to you, my D&D group. Your puzzled reactions whenever I start throwing out terms like Proton and Lutris are infinitely amusing to me. Dwarfs? This was a native Linux version that had the issues getting the screen resolution to work, but apparently some weird aspect of how it was coded meant compelling it into Proton didn't work, even after trying something from ProtonDB to add the correct dependencies. Even then it failed to boot up, so I had to configure it in such a way that it would actually show up properly without some rendering issue cutting off some pixels at the top. And after tampering with it, apparently the solution completely disabled my second monitor, requiring me to re-enable and reposition it in the settings. Oh, and skipping over the dialogue didn't stop the prior line, but caused it to keep playing with another one over it. So that's a nice bug even after you wrangle the thing into submission. So yeah, if ever you want to play this bizarre game from 2011, good freaking luck. Risk of Rain 2. The test OS had no sound effects despite music working just fine, and otherwise played just fine, while my main OS had zero issues. According to ProtonDB, what I encountered on the test OS is a minority of use cases, though there were a different minority of players who ran into performance issues further in their runs than I managed to reach in my attempts, so take that with a grain of salt. Star Wars Jedi Knight Dark Forces 2. This was one I had no expectation for and was still disappointed, because it didn't work well when I reviewed it early in my time on YouTube, and that was on a Windows PC. To get it workable back then, I just bought the GOG version. Since I couldn't figure out how to get past the main menu due to a major visual glitch without modding, and had to do a hard reset on my computer after it locked up on one attempt, we'll just loop back to this when we talk about GOG games. And this does include Mysteries of the Sith as well. Empire Total War. Who could have possibly guessed that the buggiest Total War game I own would end up here? Initially, this seemed like a wrong monitor native Linux version, which, fair enough, we've seen plenty of those. And then I switched to Proton, and it crashed on startup. Repeatedly. The logs from running Steam via the terminal didn't even give me anything useful. So, what I recorded was on my second monitor, which did work just fine, but having to look at my second monitor the whole time instead of my main screen is certainly a nuisance worth putting down here, especially given that it only happened because Proton didn't work. Apart from that, here's a list of games I've been able to get working with very little tampering, or had issues that weren't serious with or without tampering. Satisfactory. It took some fiddling to get the windowed mode to cooperate, but otherwise required no input from me beyond what we've already discussed. Palworld. The only bug I encountered can be more easily chalked up to survival game jank than a compatibility layer issue, and which I believe was fixed with the crossplay update. Otherwise, there was some weirdness with window resizing when moving from full screen borderless to windowed mode, but it wasn't a major impediment. Super Sanctum TD. There was a crash near the end of one mission I attempted, but that was the only issue I encountered. Marvel Rivals. There was a period of time near the start of Season 1 where it wouldn't boot if I didn't tell it to run as if I was on a Steam Deck, but that got fixed up with Proton Experimental pretty quickly, and apart from a hiccup from a mid-Season 2 update, I've had few issues since. Fate. I encountered performance issues, but they're the same ones I encountered when I played and reviewed it on a Windows machine. EA's Battlefront 2. There are two possible ways this can go. Either it loads directly and it plays with minimal issues, with the only one I noticed being some stuttering in third-person mode, which didn't bother me much since I typically use first-person mode, and therefore usually only saw it if I died in multiplayer. Or it loads the EA app and is very difficult to start up, if you even can. In my case, swapping Proton versions and making sure I was automatically logged in with my EA account seemed to be enough to boot the game directly, on both main and test OS. But there's enough people who struggled bitterly with this that it's worth calling out in this section. Oh, and fair warning, if it notifies you about choosing between cloud and local saves, once you're done, it'll act as if the game is running when it's not, but hitting the stop button on Steam and restarting the game seem to do the trick. Also, for the record, I saw people giving a command to bypass the EA app, but that was in reference to Jedi Fallen Order, so I don't know if it would work in this case given the multiplayer component. Fortunately, I didn't need it for Jedi Fallen Order, either due to dealing with the EA app for Battlefront 2, or just sheer dumb luck, to where it worked perfectly. The Planet Crafter. An opposite case to Risk of Rain 2, where my test OS had zero issues, but my main OS favored my desktop's taskbar over the game if I alt-tabbed out of it in full screen, and in windowed mode locked the window to the top left corner of my main monitor. Plants vs. Zombies. Near slideshow frame rate in the setup phase is the only issue, and one that thankfully doesn't persist for any of the actual levels. Orcs Must Die 1. There were a few enemy models that didn't seem to be properly animating, which affected how well I could headshot enemies, though a cursory glance through the Steam forum suggests that it's a game issue rather than a compatibility layer issue. That said, I was unable to recreate this on my backup PC, though bear in mind that its GPU is an NVIDIA GTX 1660 instead of my main computer's AMD 6700 XT. Zoombinis. There was a rendering issue with overlapping textures flickering in between each other, but otherwise everything functioned normally. Party Hard. The gameplay itself was fine, but there were a couple of missing assets once you hit part of the game menu, which might have been from it being a native Linux version, or just the game being borked. Due to how minor it was, I didn't worry about finding out which. Supreme Commander. Anytime there was a pre-rendered video, it caused serious performance issues, and wouldn't run in real time for cutscenes. Inputting a command I found on Proton DB fixed the issue, and it and the Forged Alliance expansion worked flawlessly afterward. Banished. Audio failed to work the first time I ran it, but worked the second time, and had no issue otherwise. Apparently there's a command to get around the audio issue if it persists, though I didn't have to invoke that for my purposes. Batman Arkham Asylum. The game crashed before loading the main menu until I put in a command I found on Proton DB, at which point there were some strange performance hitches in the opening, but it was otherwise smooth sailing from there. Star Wars Dark Forces. This one might actually work better under GOG since it's a DOSBox game, which we'll get to, as I ran into some small performance hiccups during firefights, though it seemed to do fine otherwise. Sonic Adventure 1. There were some issues with my monitor's 100Hz refresh rate playing havoc with the game, but once that both game and monitor were set to the same refresh rate, the game functioned normally after that. Well, as normally as a 3D Sonic game can play, but never mind that. Off-World Trading Company. One of the tutorial missions seized up, which compelled a restart, but I was able to play a campaign mission and another tutorial mission without issue. Portal 2. This is a native Linux game, but I'm putting it here because the only issue I encountered was one where my monitor's full resolution conflicted with the 1080p resolution that I had set it to, which meant I had to reset my monitor's resolution to get the game's interface correct, or just use Proton to get around it immediately. It worked fine after either quick fix was seen to, and isn't something I'd expect a normal user to encounter. BioShock. There was an issue setting the correct resolution, but a bit of tampering in-game and a restart fixed that up, and I had no issue afterward. Rogue Legacy. There were, again, some minor issues setting the resolution, alongside telling it to go full screen, but it otherwise behaved as it should. Wargroove. The intro cutscene failed to run, to where I had to hold the skip button to reach the menu, but it otherwise worked flawlessly. The Binding of Isaac. Windowed mode seemed to be fine even if it didn't let me resize it for some reason, but when I put it into full screen, it seemed to think I wanted to see the outline of whatever it's using to determine the position of an animation. Not a major impediment, but certainly annoying. Transistor. This is a native Linux version that, at first, seemed like it would be on the list of just convert to Proton. On the native version, it started with zero audio, but switching to Proton didn't help, as if I alt-tabbed out of the greatly extended initial load time, the game would freeze on a black screen, and once I got in-game, the mouse buttons didn't work. I saw on Proton DB that it might have been possible to go into the config settings and tell the game which audio device to use, which might have fixed it, but I had trouble locating it in the place the PC Gaming Wiki said it would be. As a last-ditch effort, I tried using the legacy Linux runtime, at which point it worked perfectly. Honestly, I probably should have tried this method before hitting the Proton button on a few other games, but Transistor was game number 91 I had looked at, and there's only so much space on one's hard drive, especially given modern games. So, yeah, another thing to try if the older native Linux games don't work on the first attempt. Rome Total War. Despite it being bordered full screen, it was possible for me to accidentally click out of the game, and when it loaded back in, there was one time it did so with some missing textures. Also, the Alexander expansion is missing the introductory video and the main menu background video. Other than that, it worked great. And speaking of Rome Total War, let's look at its remaster. This is a native Linux version that seemed to work fine in the base game and Alexander, but there was a turn in Barbarian Invasion where it seemed like I wasn't allowed to build anything, and after attempting to use the sabotage action, it threw a seg fault and crashed to desktop. It doesn't seem to be that frequent, given I only encountered it in Barbarian Invasion, so I suppose the advice is just to save early, save often, for it being a total war game if nothing else. Defender's Quest. There were some minor issues leading to text appearing slightly distorted, but this didn't render it unreadable, and other than that, it worked great as a native Linux game. Star Wars Squadrons. This one was an odd case because the game works fine, but since I brought out my old Logitech Extreme 3D Pro, which is this arcane piece of sorcery called a joystick for you youngins out there, it took quite a bit of figuring out to get the damn thing calibrated properly. A program called JSCal was eventually able to serve the purpose, even if I had to run it out of a terminal. At first, this got thrown into the severe issues category because it seemingly failed to recognize the calibration and kept wanting to turn left. But somehow, while testing out the GoG games, I had managed to massage it into being recognized. I believe the reason was because I had tried using something with a GUI instead of the terminal, which only shows you the current position and doesn't actually update anything. And it kept pointing to that even after I tried invoking JSCal on the terminal. All that to say, the terminal is the easiest way to get any old joystick you have working, as it's then doable without any arcane sorcery. Unless you consider the terminal to be arcane sorcery, but that's something you get used to, and is frankly worth getting used to given how useful it is. Halo the Master Chief Collection. There was a point when first playing the collection where I saw desync while downloading other games in the collection, and another where my cursor showed up during gameplay, which went away once I had alt-tabbed a couple of times. I also saw a bunch of what seemed to be failed attempts to create a lobby during Reach Firefight matchmaking, though I couldn't tell if it was because compatibility layer or because game. Other than that, Halo 3 and ODST were also unusually quiet on both single player and multiplayer, which was fine since I could adjust my system speakers, but not ideal if I wanted to treat it as a podcast game. Though again, game issue or compatibility layer issue. Everything else worked great. Devil May Cry. The pre-rendered cutscenes seemed to stutter a bit, which was most obvious with the audio, and it looked as if the means to make them work required more than just a Proton command, but maybe even some re-rendering based on what I read. Still, that was the only issue, as in-engine cutscenes worked just fine, as did gameplay. Star Wars Jedi Knight 2 Jedi Outcast. There was a slight graphics bug in the opening cutscene, which is making me wonder if the issue The Binding of Isaac had is an isolated issue, but otherwise it worked perfectly. And speaking of which, Jedi Academy. Again, minor visual issue with the opening cutscene, which fixed itself once I altered my game's resolution, so it might be a bit wonky for a first playthrough, but hey, still works how I remember it outside of that. Grim Fandango Remastered. This game does not like to be full screen. It's a native Linux version that the normal runtime starts in windowed mode but can be put to full screen, and the legacy runtime starts full screen. But if you alt-tab at any point, you can't get it back to full screen without restarting, for either runtime. This would have been mentioned in a prior section if the Proton version didn't crash as soon as you reach the game itself, so this is one case where you're stuck with the issue. Shadow Warrior 3. There was an issue in the main menu with my mouse cursor and the area I was actually clicking on being misaligned until manually resetting the game's resolution, which was made harder to diagnose due to my controller being plugged in, as that made it harder to get through the UI without the mouse. After getting that sorted though, it worked perfectly. And finally, here are all the games that just worked with no concerns whatsoever. We've already mentioned Baldur's Gate 3, Grim Dawn, and Jedi Fallen Order, but there's also Stardew Valley, Antechamber, Battle for Westnoth, Dead Cells, Vampire Survivors, Hades 1 and 2, Doom 2016, Undertale, Ziggurat, Insanaquarium, Sanctum, Sonic CD, Slime Rancher, Please Don't Touch Anything, Bloons Tower Defense 6, Oxygen Not Included, Team Fortress 2, Bastion, Orcs Must Die 2 and 3, Horde, Dungeon Defenders, Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transformed, The Banner Saga, Supreme Commander 2, Space Plan, Knights of Pen and Paper 2, Super Meat Boy, Wargroove 2, Peggle, Shatter, Hollow Knight, Torchlight 1 and 3, Valkyria Chronicles 1 and 4, BioShock Remastered, Risk of Rain, Transformers War for Cybertron, Shadow Warrior 2013, Darkest Dungeon, Middle-earth Shadow of War, Cuphead, Don't Starve, Among Us, Final Fantasy VII, Stories The Path of Destinies, Sonic Adventure 2, Left 4 Dead 2, Metal Gear Rising Revengeance, Magicka, Sonic Generations, Deltarune, Portal, Cat Quest, Deadlock, Plague Inc. Evolved, and last but not least, Hollow Knight Silksong. And with that, those are all of the games I tested out on Steam. I didn't play every game in my Steam account, as there are some that are multiplayer only which don't have much, if any, active player base anymore, and a few that I haven't played at all and need to make time for at some point. But hopefully this offered a decent sample set for a variety of different genres released at a bunch of different times. In the likely event that a game you're curious about wasn't looked at here, I would encourage you to check out a website called ProtonDB. I've mentioned it a few times already, as it's a website designed to catalog the overall performance of Proton with respect to individual games, and is really useful when identifying and debugging issues commonly faced, which proved invaluable for getting games with minor issues like Supreme Commander working perfectly. So, for those of you not keeping score, here's the final tally for the Steam games. Of the 126 games I tested, depending on how you count expansions and bundles, 61 worked with 0 issues, with 21 of them being native Linux versions, and the rest being run through Proton. Every other game had some kind of issue, with 23 of them being native Linux games that had 0 issues when compiled into Proton, while 14 others required some other kind of tampering to get right, but worked perfectly afterward. 22 of them had minor lingering issues that were either purely setup related or didn't have a major effect on gameplay, while 5 of them had severe issues depending on the game or how your PC or Steam is set up. So yeah, almost half of them worked right from the start, and of those that didn't work right from the start, less than half of those had lingering issues once some tampering was done, even if some of the tampering might involve changing how you install Steam. Considering that most of these are being run through Proton, I'd say that's quite a fine result compared to how difficult it used to be to get games working properly in Linux even half a decade ago. Based on that, Steam appears to be in good shape, but that's not where all of our games may be found. Since I was compelled to dig it back up on a night my D&D group wasn't prepared, I also checked if Minecraft works, for those of you who still play that. And while I'd need a compatibility layer if I wanted to play the Bedrock edition or the 2 spin-offs in the Minecraft launcher, the Java edition worked like a charm. So rest assured, if you've got family members or friends who still play this, you're still able to as well. Next up, for some of us, we may have a decent number of older games on a GOG account, especially since GOG has made it clear that anything we buy through their site is 100% ours and not just a license, especially since it's mandated that anything on there is DRM free, multiplayer component notwithstanding. However, since GOG doesn't have a Steam Deck they need to maintain, there might be some effort required to get it all working out of the box. Thus, allow me to introduce you to Lutris. It's intended to be a one-stop shop for basically every game in your library, regardless of the launcher, and can also assist with setting up emulators and whatnot. However, the unfortunate aspect is that it's not a solution that works immediately. It's suggested that you install a version of Wine onto your system, independent of the Lutris installation. And yeah, that proved to be necessary when I attempted to skip that step in the test OS. It's also worth mentioning that, depending on the Lutris version, the default version of Wine may be an older one. The most recent version of Lutris defaults to GE Proton, which has a few extra bells and whistles added and to my knowledge is easier to run independent of Steam. But due to how I installed Lutris on the test OS, the default for that version is a GE version of Wine, which will cause us some trouble. Short version, if you want the bleeding edge, install it via Flatpak, not Debian. Still, for our purposes, we'll stick to what's available for someone without that knowledge. And to make it further interesting, given the whole you own your game's DRM free shtick, the original way to play a game you bought off GOG was to download an installer. Because of that, Lutris defaults to grabbing the installer and getting the game working that way. So, if you want your cloud saves, achievements, or multiplayer, it then means for games like Into the Breach, the only way I had to get my save data, even temporarily, was to run it via GOG Galaxy, despite it having a native Linux version that works quite well. Luckily, Into the Breach isn't very demanding, so that was no issue, and neither was getting GOG Galaxy installed and operational through Lutris rather than through my own blood, sweat, and frustrations. Though, bear in mind that my default was to use the direct installers, especially since Lutris is able to go, hang on a minute, this is a DOS game, or something that uses ScumVM. Let's just run it out of there rather than through Wine. Because of that, the original release for Riven ran without issue through ScumVM, while Warcraft 1, Heretic, Populous, and Dungeon Keeper ran without issue via DOSBox. Though, looking to some of the Windows games, there were a couple of overlapping issues I faced. In both cases, they were minor configuration issues that, once dealt with, allow me to run them with basically no trouble. In one case, the game may have trouble finding what it's supposed to run, at which point switching to GOG's.lnk file was usually sufficient, instead of whatever executable file Lutris thought should be used. This applied to Rime and Warcraft 2, with the latter also needing me to tell it to go full screen so it didn't do something weird. In other cases, you'll sometimes see two options when installing games, GOG and GOG auto-generated. I'm not sure what the distinction there is, but while you might think, oh, go with the custom option, which is what I defaulted to, there were some games that only properly installed or ran after installing the auto-generated version. This applied to the 2014 Unity remake for Myst and classic Battlefront 1. So, since there's fewer games to go through for GOG than Steam, let's run down the line for the remainder and see what kind of stuff I ran into, in no particular order. Battlezone 98 Redux. There was some weird flickering with the map, and the audio seemed unusually loud, but otherwise it worked just fine. Diablo. Getting this game to work without modding proved to be a pain in the ass, as it kept crashing after getting past the opening cutscene. Getting the game to work by defaulting to the Devolution X mod proved to be a cinch, so while it might not be the original experience, it does work in that mode. The Infinity Engine games. Bear in mind that what I have to say is for the original versions, as I don't own any of the enhanced editions. That said, there are a few technical Linux versions, with GOG having set up Wine environments that cooperate with them, and that was my only way to get them working without unbearably heavy stuttering. Icewind Dale 1 and 2 are practically unplayable because of that, and while Lutris offered to use something called GemRB to run the second game natively, it failed to run due to an old Python 2.7 dependency, which is a version of Python that's not officially supported anymore, so yeah, that one would require more intervention than I'm prepared to deal with. And even for the quote-unquote Linux versions I had, Lutris had trouble installing them, so I defaulted to the direct installers instead. Though GOG's setup for Linux handling is odd. You choose option 1 on the desktop shortcuts they give you, it plays havoc with your display settings while forcing it into full screen, with the only complete fix for the resulting mess being a system restart. You choose option 2, and it's in windowed mode and impossible to resize. And since these games were originally 6400 by 480, with an 800 by 600 option for Baldur's Gate 2, it may be ideal if you have a guide up, but not if you want to use your cursor to move the view. All that to say, Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 as well as Planescape Torment are playable if not under ideal circumstances. Icewind Dale 1 and 2, not so much. The Witcher franchise. Before it's asked, I've played all of an hour of The Witcher 3, so I can't speak with authority on that one. So I kept my focus to the first and second games. The first one had some graphical hiccups, but considering the game's age, it's a minor hiccup more so than a major concern. The second game also had one or two graphical mishaps, but they were so infrequent and so blink and you miss it that you could arguably put this game into the no issue box. Not that I did, but we'll get to that. Hob. I encountered some frame drops while playing this, for which my gut instinct is that they're optimization issues rather than compatibility layer issues, especially since one frame drop hit at the exact same place when I was retracing my steps. That said, I don't necessarily have a good frame of reference for this one, as the only time I played it before now was on a potato PC that predates my 2019 build, which meant it played at an inconsistent 30 FPS when I was recording. Heroes of Might and Magic 3. This is a similar situation to Diablo where the base game failed to work, but installing the HD mod did the trick. This is one case where installing the later version of Lutris might help me out if I want the original version in its original resolution, but since the HD mod works, it's not a big deal. The Myst franchise. Yeah, wondered where this was when we mentioned ScumVM and Riven, huh? The first one seemed like it would slot in there with no issue, but apparently there's some video files in there that don't all work the way they should, which caused my game to consistently crash every time I tried to rotate this over here. It is possible to fix this according to the internet, but the fact that you have to go through and manually re-render the files to make it work is rather obnoxious, and is beyond the scope of what most normie users would find comfortable. Which is unfortunate, because I saw this fix for the Devil May Cry issue as well, and this is one case where such a manual intervention may be necessary instead of a nice to have, despite how many video files are tucked away in the game files. Supposedly the Steam version works just fine funnily enough, and when I went to my main OS, where I have Lutris set up with Proton GE, I was able to recreate that by using the direct installer, and running it via Proton instead of directly via ScumVM. As for the remakes, we've mentioned the Unity version as part of the configuration change games, and the Unreal/VR remakes only issue was the company logo not playing properly, with everything else working just as it did on Windows. Oh, and while I'm at it, the Riven remake also functioned normally, with the only issue being some minor graphical issue near the bottom of the screen, which didn't persist for any of the main exploration. Pyre. Wondered where this was when every other Supergiant game was mentioned? Well, it's one I bought on GOG for reasons that I can't remember, and thankfully it's a native Linux version whose only issue was a lack of music in the main menu. Shadow Warrior 2. This was one of the rare non-native games that worked great right out of the box, though bear in mind that I installed it independent of GOG Galaxy, so I don't know how well it would run if you want your cloud saves. The Descent franchise. Lutris knew enough to include the DXX Rebirth mods as an option, even if I had to install some dependencies via the terminal to get D1X Rebirth to run. But a quick internet search had that fixed up pretty quickly, and most likely fixed up any corresponding issues with D2X Rebirth failing to run as well. That said, there was an issue I couldn't find an easy solution for in both games, where every time a sound effect played, there was also a bunch of garbage audio, which is unfortunate because that was basically the only issue, and they otherwise ran perfectly. And even if you wanted to use the original DOS version, Descent 1's was the only one I tried, and it seemed to have a game speed issue that I didn't attempt to fix. As for Descent 3, that one took a bit of configuring for the cutscenes to show up properly, and for some reason the save hotkey didn't work, but other than that, it functioned normally. And since we're talking about a game series that can use a joystick, let's see how FreeSpace 1 and 2 fared, shall we? The first game failed to recognize my throttle controls despite evidence to the contrary, and if I alt-tabbed out of the game, it would sometimes mess with where my mouse cursor was allowed to move. The second game didn't have the alt-tabbing issue, but also failed to properly recognize my throttle controls, so in both cases, I was confined to use keyboard buttons for same. To see if it made a difference, I also installed FreeSpace Open, which was able to easily tap into what Lutris installed, and was able to go through a few missions with the throttle controls working, so as always, it's worth setting that up. Dungeon Keeper 2. This one I recall being able to bring up to 1080p on Windows 10, though even with an install that ostensibly allowed that via Lutris, the best I could get it to was 1280 by 1024. Still, it worked great otherwise. The Moto Racer franchise. Before someone asks, old bike racing series from back in the olden days. The first game worked great, the second game also worked great, and the third game, wait for it, froze on a white rectangle in the top left corner of my monitor and failed to get any further than that. Ironic, considering it was the game I played the least of between the three. Populous 2. For some reason, this one, despite running out of DOSBox, ran like garbage. Given how similar it is to the first game, it's not a major loss, but still worth mentioning. The Tomb Raider franchise. Yes, we're looking at both originals and remasters of 1 through 3. The first game's original DOS version didn't work, but installing it with the TR1X mod allowed it to work perfectly. The second game's original release technically worked, but didn't have any music in the main menu, and it only responded to my controller's analog stick, not any of the buttons. Eventually, after something weird happened and the game got stuck doing the same action over and over, I just installed the TR2X mod and was back to smooth sailing. The third game I was really curious about, as while I reviewed the first two a long time ago, I never did the third game, because it failed to work properly on Windows 10. So in this environment, I was morbidly curious to see how it would do. And while it did boot, after using a mod, it didn't have proper controller support, and had zero audio past the opening cutscene. So yeah, not ideal. So then we turned to the remaster, and luckily for us, all three games within that bundle worked perfectly. Populous: The Beginning. This was a curious case because fairly early in my time on YouTube, I had planned to review this and got pretty far. But when I tried jumping back in after spending months away from it, the graphics and performance had taken a noticeable hit due to some older Windows compatibility issues. So I was curious to see how the graphics and performance would turn out, and looking back on some old footage, it looks like it was the original graphics settings I encountered, which worked great. The Heretic and Hexen remaster. This one I tested within a couple days of it going live, and because of how new this remaster is, the default Lutris installation was not necessarily in its favor. You dig into the game files, and it's basically a wrapper around the original DOS files, so the default installer got confused, thought it was a purely DOS game, and failed to work. Fortunately, I was able to install and run it perfectly, either by just running wine out of a terminal pointing to the original installer and later its executable, or by feeding Lutris the installer independent of its entry in my GOG library. If you've got the most recent version of Lutris, you can also tell it to just use wine with Proton GE instead of the DOSBox runner, and that also seems to clear it up. A bit of extra work, but for a game this relatively simple, it's more than adequate. Night Dive does good work, ladies and gentlemen, and kudos to them and id Software for dropping it in my lap since I owned the originals on GOG already. I'm half tempted to throw $15 their way on Steam as thanks. And finally, a grab bag of Star Wars games we haven't mentioned yet, which I own on GOG. Dark Forces 2 gave me the same error as before, and attempting to install a remastered mod also failed to work properly via Lutris, so I was SOL on this one. Republic Commando worked great if you didn't mind that full screen was basically impossible to get working. Classic Battlefront 2 also worked great, with the only caveat being that the resolution for menus remained 4:3 compared to the widescreen resolution chosen for the game itself. But that's something I'm pretty sure we can chalk up to the game rather than the compatibility layer. Galactic Battlegrounds didn't let me view what I was typing for things like names and save files, but otherwise worked just fine. Rogue Squadron... What isn't work with this game? The audio is a second behind, the game didn't let me assign a name to my pilot, alt-tabbing the game locked it, and your fighter can get away from your camera if you don't hit F1 or have fraps open. And in case the word fraps doesn't give it away, the audio and camera issues also show up in Windows. So consider this game borked as hell. A part of me is curious to see if you're unironically better off running it through an N64 emulator, though obviously buy it on Steam or GOG before you do that. I like my game preservation, but I naturally draw the line at piracy. Knights of the Old Republic had a few character models that seemed to occasionally load in with a surprisingly low polygon count, even for 2003, and there were instances where the main menu backdrop showed up a bit in pre-rendered cutscenes, but otherwise it functioned perfectly. For Knights of the Old Republic 2, I'm surprised there weren't as many install options compared to the first game, especially when an option to include the restored content mod would be a welcome addition. Still, even if I didn't worry about that for my purposes, apparently it ran without issue, and even had widescreen support built in. Shows you how long since I played this, huh? I'll need to fix that at some point. Oh, did I say finally? Sorry, I forgot to do the joke, so brace yourself, boys, because believe it or not, Linux indeed can run Doom. I know, big shocker, world-shattering stuff right there, but I figured I should mention it anyway. Though for some reason, GOG didn't offer the original DOS versions, but instead gave me a bunch of options after buying it, and I faced similar troubles installing it as I did with the Heretic remaster because of that. But hey, it works, so do I really have room to complain here? And with that, those were the GOG games. Again, there's more than just that in my GOG library, but since I haven't played all of them, I focused on what I've spent time with and, in most cases, have outright completed. That in mind, of the 49 games I tested, 13 of them worked with no issue, with only one of those being a native Linux game, 5 of them running out of DOSBox or ScumVM, while the remaining 7 were non-native games using Lutris' implementation of Wine. Of those that remained, 12 required some kind of tampering, whether it be a mod, configuration change, or what have you, in order to work properly. 17 had minor lingering issues, while 7 had major issues. Definitely not as good a result as the Steam games, which isn't terribly surprising considering that it wasn't defaulting to the latest and greatest you'd find for Proton, since this was a long-term service version. Sure, I could say that at least the minor issues were really minor issues like in The Witcher 2's case, but still, that's the irony of the PC space right now. You either go through Steam and have it typically work better in Linux but don't technically own the game, or you go through GOG and own it completely DRM-free but have more of a hassle getting it working outside of a native Windows environment. This particular canard won't persist past April of 2026 though, as that's when the next long-term service version of Ubuntu will release. So hopefully the Debian Lutris installation will also be updated accordingly, to where you won't have to worry about that if you're not tech savvy. So now that we've looked over all of this, it certainly looks promising for anyone who may wish to abandon Windows entirely, especially for those who have an older computer that basically has no choice but to, if they don't want to spend a bunch on new hardware. The GOG games had a lot more tinkering required, but if you're on Steam exclusively, you've got a lot that's just working without any concern. However, let us now ask the expected question as we approach the end of this video: will Linux ever overtake Windows in terms of gaming? Well, as cool as all of this is, and as much as I appreciate all of this for my own purposes, the only way that I can realistically see Linux overtaking Windows is not if Linux becomes an objectively better option in every way, but instead because Windows screws up so royally that the pain of leaving it behind will overtake the pain of learning something new. That might seem like a cynical take to give at the end of this, after showing how much progress has been made, but think about the flip side to the first game I showcased. In order to get Torchlight 2 to work in Linux, it was easier for me to enable Proton than it was for me to wrestle the native Linux version into submission. On one hand, this means that adoption will be easier on the consumer side. On the other hand, what motivation do developers have to get their games working on Linux when the compatibility layer will do the work for them? When Valve, wanting to ensure their Steam Deck and SteamOS are worth investing in, will do the work for them. In fact, there's even been a case where a developer has said, hey, we're not gonna worry about a native Linux version anymore, since the Proton version is just more stable and simpler to get working with fewer issues. Granted, this is something you see with older Windows games as well, as my Knights of the Old Republic DVD didn't work on my machine when it was geared to Windows 10, so the whole draw for GOG was that I could pay $6 to get a copy that does. And yet, there's a major difference between getting a game to work on a modern version of the same OS for a beloved RPG, as opposed to getting a game to work whose development house closed down almost a decade ago for a niche player base within a niche player base on a completely different OS. This is something I'm having to contemplate myself, as I have game dev ambitions, with my focus right now being on a design document and script before I commit my ideas to code. Even as I'm using Linux for my day-to-day, that's not the overwhelming majority of gamers. So is it even worth supporting an official Linux version when the compatibility layer will do the heavy lifting for me, and when what I have in mind won't be graphically intensive enough to be an issue for same? You think it's bad that devs and publishers have less motivation to optimize their games when upscalers like DLSS and FSR can do the heavy lifting for them? Just imagine the hurdle for an entirely different operating system with multiple minor variations depending on the distro, all of which only represent 2% of Steam's player base. Okay, if you want to be pedantic, then it's closer to 3% nowadays, but why would you target a 3% when you can target the 95 to 96%? My PC currently has 2 operating systems installed, the long-term service version of Ubuntu and the latest version of Kubuntu. The only major differences are the version number, the front-end components, and how Games/Steam are installed, not the underlying operating system. And yet there were multiple points where I saw different behavior between the two on games like the Planet Crafter and Risk of Rain 2. It's difficult enough to get different hardware configurations to all work well in a game, let alone when the OS it's running with could gum up the works as well. And that's before I mention some major handicaps that you have to grapple with. As you'll notice, there are 2 things that are conspicuous by their absence: games with de novo, and a lot of competitive multiplayer games. For the former, I've never purchased a game with the DRM installed because I'm not willing to put up with the performance hits that often come with it, or the occasional phone's home meaning I can't play it offline, or the possible concerns it might have for my SSD shelf life. While the DRM does still work on Linux, there's also install limits associated with it, which, due to how Proton works, can easily be run through by just switching Proton versions. So if you thought I was silly earlier to avoid games I'd otherwise like, such as anything Sega has published in the last few years, now I have even more reason not to go anywhere near it, especially for a game that may work better on one Proton version or another. At this rate, the only way I'll be playing a modern Sega game for the next decade is if it gets a Switch 2 version. And even then, I've had the chance to try out something like Persona through that avenue, which I'd probably really like if I dug into them, but then the stink of either shackling it to a device that will inevitably become obsolete or dealing with de novo has kept me away. As for competitive multiplayer games, some of them did feature here, but there's a catch, because kernel-level anti-cheat, which you see from a lot of newer games, basically doesn't exist on Linux. The reason is that the kernel level is something that a compatibility layer can't replicate, since it's the main interaction between your computer's hardware and all the levels of abstraction your computer has in place from its OS to the programs running within it. and since not a lot of gamers use Linux, there's never been a need to make kernel-level anti-cheat targeting the Linux kernel. So, unless developers enable the user-level version of software like Easy Anti-Cheat, like what Microsoft did with the Halo games, credit where it's due on that one, Linux gamers are otherwise just SOL. And there have been high-profile cases where developers have said, no, we're not enabling this, with Respawn catching some heat for not even allowing Steam Deck users into Apex Legends due to how easy it is for me to pretend that my desktop PC is one. While Riot's kernel-level anti-cheat was put onto League of Legends a couple years ago, killing any chance I might have had to replicate my old success getting it to work. I'd basically have to set up a virtual machine or use my backup PC if I wanted to now. Which I don't, because since it doesn't shut itself off when the game is off, I'm going to act on the assumption that it's spyware for whatever data harvesting operation Tencent might engage in. It's also worth mentioning that I had an easier time of it because my GPU is currently an AMD device. And anyone who knows anything about Linux knows that Nvidia and Linux don't always get along. In fact, the Steam Deck's GPU is a custom AMD setup, because while AMD does provide pretty good support for Linux, Nvidia, not so much. Though bear in mind that I can't so easily confirm the current status myself, since my GTX 1660 wasn't exactly bleeding edge even when I bought it in 2019. It served me well while it was my main GPU, but isn't something I'll be expecting to handle the modern day big boys. Because of all of this, I don't see Linux taking over unless Windows becomes so horrifically user-unfriendly that it's abandoned en masse. That's not an impossible proposition, as based on my backup PC, apparently even something as simple as a file explorer can be made less efficient for some stupid reason. But even then, we're trading one set of it doesn't just work for another. And why would people make the jump unless they're really pissed off by something Microsoft just did? On my backup PC, I have to deal with some annoying messages from Microsoft about Game Pass and the File Explorer freezing up for a few seconds when I just want to make a new folder, because some middle manager or low-level employee needed to justify their existence in the corporate machine somehow. On my main PC though, I've had to do a decent amount of configuring to do things that just worked in Windows, such as backing up files to my NAS programmatically. In fact, that's the irony of the situation I find myself in. Because after working near exclusively out of Linux since October of last year, I find myself in a situation where I feel it necessary to go back to dual booting. Not because my video games don't operate the way they should, but because my ambitions as a YouTube hobbyist and game developer mean I need a foot in both worlds. On the game dev side, I'll get much better comparisons performance-wise if the only difference is the OS being used to run it, on both the main PC and the backup. Even if I prefer to encourage Linux adoption by making sure my game works there, either natively or in Proton, I will need the baseline expectations set. And on the YouTube hobbyist side, if I'm reviewing a game that straight up doesn't work on Linux yet, or is a pain in the ass to get working there, that could artificially limit what I'm able to look at. Even if a given game does work just fine, not only will it be easier to get a one-to-one for performance, there's a decent amount that's just easier to deal with on Windows. To start with that NAS backup I mentioned, I have a Synology NAS setup on my desk, which I use to have a one-to-one backup of every essential file on my main PC. Synology's built-in tools to back things up don't allow me to customize the file structure as much as I'd like, so I have a basic program I use to back up my PC weekly, in the event I get a catastrophic hard drive failure. On Windows, it's as simple as pointing to the network drive. On Linux, I need to mount the NAS as if it's a local drive, and then the same file sync program will recognize it, but only if I'm running it as a super user, or admin for those familiar with Windows terminology. And if there's anything the NAS is backing up to the main PC, it's in read-only mode unless I reset file permissions for it, due to it being copied over as an admin. To simplify this, I have a couple of shell scripts I run out of a terminal, one to mount it properly, and another to do a blanket file permission reset. It took a bit of configuring and research to get that sorted, and I am a software guy for my day job, so shell scripts aren't something I'm scared of, but it is a more complicated process than just pointing to the network drive and hitting go. On the YouTube side of things, there's an audio plugin created by iZotope that I bought a license for a few years back, which has some really easy to use noise cancellation and a means to reduce any annoying sounds you get from dry mouth. I've used both for local off-the-cuff recordings, and the latter for basically everything that isn't live. But its DRM is such that getting it to work in Wine is next to impossible without engaging in piracy, so I've been using my backup PC to apply it to files and then shipping them back for editing on the main PC. If I could just jump into Windows and hear it right alongside without needing to introduce a bunch of extra rendering on another machine, that'd be a lot less effort. And honestly, the audio editing software I'm using, namely Reaper, just has less pain points under Windows anyway, since I'm not beholden to whatever audio configuration my current Linux distro is using, including whatever absurd amount of latency that introduced with Pulse Audio in Kubuntu, and aren't confined to a shockingly basic file explorer when I just want to save a new project or open an existing one. I mean, seriously, this thing can't even make a new folder. Next up, one of the games I plan on covering someday is a console exclusive that only partially released outside of Japan. I won't say any more than that, as I don't intend to say the name until the review is ready, only that applying a translation patch has been a non-trivial task in Linux, as with how niche the game is, most of the documentation for getting that done exists in Windows. Once I'm done with the test OS for this video, I can cordon off a part of my SSD for experiments like this, so that I'm not installing a bunch of random software that may or may not play nice with my otherwise stable setup, or I could just set it up in the backup PC and have it done much more simply. Or in future cases, why not have a Windows partition on my main, more powerful PC to directly experiment with that? Speaking of more powerful, as part of the move to Linux, I had to give up a really nice internal capture card for my Switch, because Elgato simply didn't have a driver for it in Linux, and the third-party drivers I could find didn't cover the specific model. It's now sitting in my brother's PC, so it's not as if it's collecting dust, relatively speaking anyway, but part of me wonders if the troubles I'm running into with my current external capture card are because of Linux, or because of the capture card. If the console is off before OBS starts, I get desync between the audio and video, at least with respect to monitoring. And since getting a Switch 2, I also have another problem where it sometimes loses the signal entirely when loading a game from the main menu, and comes back highly saturated, with the easy fix being to restart OBS, which isn't a practical solution if I'm live. I'd very much like to know if it's because of the OS or capture card, and the only way I'll know for certain is if I either set it up and test it out on the backup PC, or install Windows on main. Though since the Switch 2 can handle 4K, I might want to get a new capture card if I want to be able to show that off anyway. Not that I can do too much there since my main monitor is a 1440 ultra-wide, but still, long-term goals once I have the disposable income for it. Now, I will grant you that, save for some of the game eccentricities, much of what I've just detailed is something that the overwhelming majority of you are never going to have to worry about. And even with all of this, at most it's death by 1,000 cuts, since I have workarounds like a backup PC, or ways to configure my main machine to where it doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. And yet, if I'm able to do that, and have gotten used to it over the last year, why wouldn't I keep things as they are? Well, because of the uncertainty surrounding one single word: Wayland. Again, this is something you are unlikely to learn anything about unless you're deep in the weeds, because if your system is working as it should, you shouldn't know anything about the discourse over Wayland versus X11. And yet, that very discourse has led me to the conclusion that I can't recommend Linux to everyone. So, what am I talking about? To keep it as simple as possible, Wayland is billing itself as a core component for your computer's display, and is seeking to replace the big game in town, namely X11. X11 is, to put it simply, another bit of software older than most of you watching, myself included, which includes all the spaghetti code and possible security concerns that comes with same. However, Wayland has had 16 years, or likely 17 by the time this video is done, to prove itself a superior replacement, and is still missing basic things that you otherwise take for granted, like global hotkey support. In my case, I had forgotten that I was using Wayland for the test OS at one point, and lost 40 minutes of a Baldur's Gate 3 session because the F9 hotkey I've used since Fraps and Bandicam were the recording software du jour didn't trigger because OBS wasn't in focus. While I could theoretically get used to that, this also means for anyone who uses push-to-talk, you now have to jump through hoops for something otherwise extremely basic, if your voice app isn't in focus. If your primary use case is playing multiplayer games with your friends, using Discord with push-to-talk, and your choice is a Windows PC or a Linux PC using Wayland, it's just easier to stay on Windows where you don't have to fiddle with workarounds. And that's just 2 use cases. If I wanted to add a few minutes to this section, we could dive into rabbit holes about accessibility, and legacy hardware and software, especially since they had to create something like X-Wayland as a middle ground for the software part, and the fact that it doesn't play nice with basically any screen recording software, making OBS an objectively inferior version under Wayland compared to X11. That said, this is all open source. Every time someone gets mad at even the slightest thing imaginable, it's cause to break all contact, take your balls somewhere else, and make your own castle with slightly different window dressing and call yourself the new hotness. But enough about Protestants. So if this is such a big deal to me, can't I just keep going with what I have? Well, the problem is that what I have right now is Kubuntu. Past the version I'm currently on, new installs aren't going to include an X11 option, which means if I want to keep my system as is, I have to potentially accept a slowly degrading user experience. And if I ever have to reinstall it from scratch, that adds another step on what I need to set up. And even that's a temporary measure, since KDE Plasma, the part that makes it different from vanilla Ubuntu, and which SteamOS is using for its desktop version by the way, will also be abandoning X11 support once it reaches 7.0. It's not something I have to worry about now, but is something I'll have to worry about in the foreseeable future, where I either have to hope this basic feature gets properly implemented when it's been so many years already, or find an alternative. And there are alternatives out there, but when even a really stable and slow-moving front-end like XFCE is experimenting with Wayland support, can I really guarantee that they won't come to the same conclusion and I'll be forced to course correct again? Sure, there are projects like Wayback and Ex Libre, but the former is still in its infancy and therefore an unknown, and the latter has been tangled in the culture wars since its inception and will struggle to see widespread adoption because of it, even if it accomplishes what it sets out to do. This is the crux of why I'm returning to dual booting. I don't like a lot of what Microsoft has been up to, and it would be nice to see them receive some proper competition on the operating system front. And, to be fair, for a lot of people, the caveats I've mentioned won't matter, either because they don't use push-to-talk, don't care about the games that had problems, or don't make videos and wouldn't care about even half of what I mentioned relating to that. But at the same time, there's going to be a bunch of other niche use cases like mine, and when all of those add up, it's going to slow down adoption unless Microsoft really screws up. And to be fair, it is Microsoft, but screws up enough to where people would accept the hiccups of learning an entirely new system, rather than having the frog continue to slowly boil through yet another part of Windows that's annoying to deal with. That, I suspect, would take severe and repeated disruptions to enough people's workflow to affect a change, which isn't outside the realm of possibility, but isn't something worth planning around. With all of that being said, following this grand experiment, I find myself both encouraged and disheartened at the same time. Because at one point, it would have been my video games that kept me from spending all of my time in Linux. And while there's still more tinkering required than even I may want to deal with for a few of them, it is in much better shape, to where I'm largely able to put up with said hiccups. I've been able to stream entire game playthroughs off of this machine, and finish playthroughs of newer games like Satisfactory and Baldur's Gate 3, with minimal differences between Windows and Linux. Now though, it's everything except the video games that has me second guessing my decision. So at this point, my plan is as follows. I'm keeping the Kubuntu partition for as long as it's useful, but we'll be shrinking it from a terabyte to 750 gigs. Then, after wiping the test OS, I'll put in a Windows 11 partition that's also 750 gigs, for when there's something I need it specifically for, such as that audio plugin. That will leave the remainder for me to experiment with an alternative if KDE Plasma leaves my use case behind, which could end up replacing the Kubuntu partition eventually. To make a long video short, if your only concerns are the video games, and you have a computer that literally can't be upgraded to Windows 11, or would be slow as molasses if you did, Linux is a viable alternative for a lot of your library, though there will be some tinkering required to get your entire library in working order. And if you're forced to use Wayland, push-to-talk is going to be a pain in the ass to set up. If you're in that scenario, and aren't in a position to spend a bunch on new hardware, then a distro like Xubuntu or Bazzite would be something worth trying out, as the former is really lightweight due to using XFCE as its front end, and the latter is meant to be the closest thing to SteamOS for a desktop. For the rest of us, as doom and gloom as I might be about my current use case, I would still encourage you to try out dual booting. I don't intend to leave Linux behind anytime soon, since based on my brother's experience and my work laptop, there could easily be some grass is greener on the other side going on, and there are things that Linux does better. For whatever reason, OBS, for as long as it remains viable in Linux, has little to no latency between when I speak and when it gets picked up, which was not the case in Windows, a fact I appreciate whenever I catch myself humming to the music in whatever I'm playing. Kubuntu is also the first OS I've encountered that immediately recognized that my Focusrite has two microphone inputs, and separated them at the OS level, meaning I don't have to worry about plugging in either my condenser or my dynamic, but can just push a button to choose which one to use. And finally, there's going to be less distraction since I know exactly what I put on it, and don't have someone looking over my shoulder telling me that I should really check out Copilot or Game Pass. And really, that's the beauty of the PC space. Whatever our grumblings, it's your machine, your software, how you need it to be, with eccentricities that you grow used to regardless of where you end up. If you're someone with the free time and technical know-how to be on the bleeding edge, fixing problems as you see them not just for yourself, but directly contributing to the projects you rely on, awesome, go wild. If you don't have the free time for that and need something that just works, there's options for you too. It's a fascinating time to be a PC gamer, and I'll be watching how the space changes over the next few years with great interest. Either way, that'll be all for this video, and thank you all for watching. I'm not sure what I'll be putting out next, as while I've got another long-term project I want to whittle away at, I suspect with what's left that it won't be finished by the end of the year, and that's just for one piece of it. There's plenty of PC and Switch games on the horizon, or knowing my luck, some that came out while I was in the trenches, Silk Song, so I'll have my hands full seeing what kind of trouble I can get myself up to. Whatever comes next, I hope it'll be worth sticking around for. For now then, I'd better get this PC reformatted, so thank you all once again for watching, and I'll see you all later.